All right. Well, thank you again for being here today, everyone. My name is Mara Leah Negrone. I use she, her pronouns, and I serve as the Director of Policy, Advocacy, and Research. And we're very excited to be here today to share our Measuring Safety, Gender-Based Violence in Illinois 2024 report that is specifically on the Survivor Fund. So with all of that out of the way, I will go ahead and leave it to my colleagues to introduce themselves.
Thanks, Marlia. I'll hop in and give a quick hello. My name is Shelby Hoffman-Binder. I use she, her pronouns, and I serve as manager of our policy advocacy and research team. And I'll pass it over to Imuna for a quick introduction as well before we get going.
Everyone, my name is Imuna McClurklin. I also use she, her pronouns, and I am the Data and Research Associate for the Policy Advocacy and Research team.
So Shelby and Imuna will be leading our presentation, but we'll go ahead and cover today's agenda. So first, we're going to start with a quick introduction, just setting the tone for today's review of the report. We're going to be covering 2024 application data for the Survivor Fund, and we're also going to be covering 2024 outcomes. So what was the results of participating in the program and receiving this cash assistance payment. And then we're going to talk about public benefit solutions and some of the work that we've been doing to support access to direct cash assistance and our vision for the future. And at the very end, we will again have that question and answer portion where we will answer questions from the Q&A chat. So I will go ahead and turn it over to Shelby to take us into the presentation.
Awesome. Thanks for setting us up, Marlia, and hello, everyone. We're going to go ahead and just do a little bit of level setting about who we are here at the network, what measuring safety is as a project, before we jump into all of the great data from this year's report. For folks who perhaps aren't familiar with the network as an organization, first and foremost, welcome. We are glad to have you here. The network is an organization that is a coalition of organizations. We work to end gender-based violence through a number of different avenues in our work. We reach and support survivors of domestic violence by operating the Illinois Domestic Violence Hotline. We also serve our member organizations who are really scattered all across the broader Chicagoland area through a number of services that includes training and professional development opportunities. It includes supporting both those organizations and their clients with resources like our housing advocacy services and the topic of today's discussion, the Survivor Fund, and many other assets. And of course, we here at the policy team provide policy advocacy really at the city, county, and state level to ensure that survivors' rights and resources, along with those of the organizations that serve them, are being protected. Measuring safety is one of the primary products of the policy advocacy and research team each year. And it is a series of data reports that we put out on sort of a wide range of topics, all of which assess experiences of gender-based violence here in Illinois and how all of our different systems that respond to GBV are doing so. We include both special reports on one-time topics, things like domestic gun violence or transportation programming you might have seen in the past. And we also have a series of reports that you'll expect from us year over year, things like the Illinois Domestic Violence Hotline data from all of our providers across the state via Infonet, and of course, today's topic, the Survivor Fund. Really, the goal of each report is to help us understand the nature of violence, gaps in our systems and services, and what is needed to move us towards that better future. We do always like to uplift that measuring safety is not a scientific study, and therefore we're never drawing causal conclusions, but we do our best with the really rich qualitative and quantitative information we do have to give folks a picture of what gender-based violence looks like here in Illinois and what we can be doing across private and public sectors to really invest in solutions that center survivors. For folks in the room who are perhaps other member organizations and DV advocates, we like to think of measuring safety as a tool for advocacy, to secure funding, and to promote education within our community about gender-based violence. And we hope that you will use it in whatever way best serves you and your organizations. There are sort of two primary sources that make up the foundation of today's report, and we want to just give you a quick once-over on what those are. First is Submittable, which is an online portal that we use to collect applications during the application process with the Survivor Fund. We also use it to distribute and collect surveys throughout the year. And it hosts internal records as well, perhaps evaluating if somebody is eligible for the Survivor Fund. Those records are then exported and analyzed in another software. And I want to just follow up on one piece I mentioned there about surveys. We'll talk much more about the nature of those surveys and the findings from those surveys later today. But what I want you to know is the basics right now. So we survey anybody who has received a grant from the Survivor Fund and has given us permission to follow up with them after they've received their grant. Those surveys go out 1 to 2 months after a payment is received, and are incentivized by offering that somebody who submits a survey will be entered into an opportunity to potentially be randomly selected for a gift card. We'll talk in much greater detail about those surveys, but what you need to know right now is that they are distributed and hosted and submittable. Also, throughout the season of producing Measuring Safety, we conduct survivor interviews, and those really help us get that rich qualitative picture directly from survivors of the impact of this program and of others. Those interviews are recruited for, in this case, directly from the pool of grantees from 2024's Survivor Fund. And they are conducted via Zoom. They're usually 90-minute calls, and we do pay folks for their time. So that is the source of all the information that we'll be talking about today. We would be remiss if we jumped into all of these numbers without talking about the work and the people that underlies them. And so we have big thank yous to share first and foremost with the staff at the Network Survivor Fund, who have shown such dedication to innovation, commitment to excellence, and really never-ending energy when it comes to serving survivors and finding ways to do it better and better each year. Their work is what underlies everything we're going to talk about today. We also owe a big debt of gratitude to the survivors we spoke to throughout this process and whose stories are featured as survivor stories, as well as quotes from our surveys throughout the report. We feel strongly that these numbers, these statistics, would not tell us the complete story without these survivor voices really being put in tandem with them. And we are incredibly grateful for the time and care that went into sharing those stories with us, as well as, of course, the trust that it takes to share those stories with us. For their safety, those survivors remain anonymous, but you can find all of their words throughout the report. Let's jump into just a little bit of background on the Survivor Fund before we talk about 2024's good work. I'll pass it over to my colleague Amuna at that time, but I'll do just a little bit of groundwork here. What is the Survivor Fund? The Survivor Fund is a program that was established in April of 2020 and is a vital financial support initiative that was specifically aimed at helping survivors of gender-based violence who were affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. The goal was really to offer that financial assistance under the theory that it bolsters both safety and economic well-being. The nature of the program has evolved over time. We will talk about that. And eligibility for funding itself at any given time. All of those details are available on our website. So you can always just head over to the-network.org/Survivor Fund to get more details about the program and where things currently stand. When we developed the network's Survivor Fund, and of course, all of the iterations of it that have come over these years, we have done so with a real focus on this evidence-based model for what is needed to operate a successful, flexible funding program that specifically targets survivors. Studies have been very clear in kind of having 4 major pillars that are the foundation for good work that is responsive to survivor needs and most effective in achieving its goals. These include being low barrier to access, shaped by survivor-driven advocacy, prioritizing flexibility in spending. So the person receiving the money has the maximum amount of flexibility in what they spend it on. And of course, swiftly disseminating the payment that has been promised. We'll talk a little bit about how prioritizing these key principles has led to evolutions in the process over time in just a moment. So as I mentioned, the Survivor Fund started in 2020, and in its first 3 years of operations, it dispersed about $1 million to 851 survivors. Now, the vast majority of that funding was focused on addressing housing-related needs. It was the clear standout need among folks who applied. And at the time, we were operating with some real constraints on how those funds could be distributed. Mostly those were restricted to vendors who were third parties providing those housing services, for example. So things like paying a landlord directly, or perhaps paying a utility company directly, as opposed to paying the survivor themselves and trusting them to spend the money on what they need. This, of course, helped address some survivors' needs, but was not in line with those evidence-based best practices, and definitely was clearly articulated as an unmet need from folks who perhaps were not able to be perfectly served by the way that program sort of was operating. In 2023, we saw a really radical expansion of the scope of the Survivor Fund, and that was thanks to investment of what are called ARPA dollars. So American Rescue Plan Act, that big bill that was sort of in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Lots of those federal dollars were invested into the Survivor Fund by the City of Chicago's Department of Family and Support Services. That radically expanded the program. So we went from 1 million over 3 years to more than $6 million distributed in 2023 alone to just under 6,000 survivors. There was also a really promising improvement, not only in scale, but also in method. And that was because this funding came with the opportunity to be issuing direct cash payments to survivors in the form of about $1,000 payments each. This meant that we were suddenly moving not only towards reaching a larger audience of folks, but also becoming much more closely in line with those evidence-based best practices of prioritizing flexibility in spending for the survivor receiving the fund. In 2024, we continued to operate at that new, very impressive scale. And we are now very proud to be able to say that we are the largest financial assistance program for survivors in the country, at least as far as we know. And that looked like in 2024, distributing just over $5 million to just over 4,000 survivors in the span of a single year. So again, really continuing to just reach an incredibly large number of people with very flexible funding. And as we'll talk about later, that reach and that flexibility has led to incredibly positive outcomes for the survivors who've been benefited by our program. How do we pay for this? You might be wondering. And funding the Survivor Fund is a project in and of itself. We have a number of funding streams each year, and you'll see that our public funding sources are listed here on this table. A couple things to sort of flag about what you're looking at. First and foremost, you'll see we're using the term public funding sources here. And that is because in addition to the funds you see in this table, in 2024, the network did also launch a closed guaranteed income pilot program that distributed about another $1 million to a group of people who were approved for that program. They are included in some of the data about applicants you'll see later today. But because of the nature of that program being closed and being formally evaluated to be released at another time, we excluded them here. So know that more information about that really innovative project is coming, but it's not going to be the center of today's discussion. You'll see here that we had 4 primary funding sources in 2024, the leader of which was quite obviously our partners at the City of Chicago's Department of Family and Support Services. Their just under $4 million investment accounted for about 98.5% of our total public funding sources. And we also had partners at Michael Reese and through the federal EFSP funding program as well, who were big supports in this process. I know that some of our funding partners are in the room. And we'd like to, of course, say a big thank you to all of you, not only for trusting us, but for trusting the survivors we serve by investing in this program. I hope you'll find that in today's presentation, you'll see that those dollars were well spent and have had a very big impact on the survivors living in our community. Each of these different funding sources, of course, comes with its own set of rules, both for our applicants and for our organization and reporting on the activities of the fund. So just want to name that sometimes different applications have different eligibility criteria, and we'll talk about that a bit later on. And that is due to the nature of having different funding streams influencing what kinds of funds are eligible to our applicants at any given time. You also heard, as I mentioned earlier, that we have sought to make improvements on our process year over year. So I thought I'd bring you all up to speed on what the application process looked like in 2024 for the Survivor Fund. Specifically, we had applications open from March to November, and they would open on the first business day of each month. When applications opened, folks could come to our website and sign up via Calendly for a 1-hour Zoom appointment. Those interview appointments were a time for Survivor Fund staff to meet with the applicant and interview them in a way that allowed them to sort of fill out the application together. And at the end of the month, anybody who went through an interview process and had their application approved was issued their payment all at once. So payments were handled in bulk. This new process created several improvements upon our 2023 process. First and foremost, the application experience itself had much more connectedness with it. So folks were able to ask questions if they didn't understand what was on the application, and they were able to access more immediately information about other resources if the Survivor Fund was not enough to perhaps address all of their needs at once. It also allowed us to provide folks with that trauma-informed support when they were being asked to disclose things about their own abuse histories. In addition to having a much lower barrier process, again, being really closely in line with those key principles, we also saw very big improvements in our payment timelines, thanks to close collaboration with our partners at the city. By sort of reconfiguring how we did that reimbursement process, we brought our payment time down to an average of 22 days, which is a 70% decrease since 2023. Another really big improvement when we think about those pillars of operating a good program, and knowing that swift dissemination of payment is really essential to building trust with our applicants. In addition to those Calendly appointments, the Survivor Fund staff also would travel to in-person opportunities to help folks apply who perhaps wouldn't be able to otherwise. These appointment opportunities came in the form of visits to social service agencies, domestic violence shelters, and the DV centralized courthouse. And they were a great way for us to reach folks who perhaps didn't have access to technology or who perhaps were not as tech savvy, and make sure they still got to access the resources they deserved. Lastly, we could not operate at this scale without a large, collaborative, trauma-informed team. That includes folks who are employed by the network, including 5.5 full-time staff, half part-time staff, 8 paid interns, and 10 paid contractors, all of whom were helping us get those applications in, reviewed, and responded to in a timely fashion. But it also included folks who were our partners at domestic violence agencies who educated themselves on our process and referred folks to the application when it was needed. We also partnered with the language line to provide interpretation services for non-English appointments if bilingual staff or advocates weren't available. All of that background out of the way, I will pass things over to Imuna to talk us through the actual application data from 2024.
Thank you, Shelby. This part of the presentation is going to be about the recipients who received the Survivor Fund. A large quantity of survivors applied for the Survivor Fund, but this part of the presentation is about survivors who applied and received payments. In terms of who applied for the Survivor Fund, there are multiple types of people who can fill out an application. The majority of people who fill out an application are survivors, but some are advocates submitting on behalf of a client, and also adults submitting on behalf of a minor. About 78% of people who applied were survivors, 22% were advocates, and less than 1% were minors. Advocates can accompany a client to appointments even if they aren't applying on behalf of their survivor. That's really according to the key principle of limiting barriers to entry, making sure that survivors have support every step of the way of the application. In terms of how survivors are connected to the Survivor Fund, the majority of referrals to the fund come from community, nonprofit, or religious organizations. 29% also come from friends, family, and other survivors. We also get referrals from online searches or social media and from poster signs and other forms of advertising. The referral services really highlight the importance of community organizations knowing about the Survivor Fund so that they can connect survivors to the fund, and also the powerful aspect of word of mouth that goes into connecting applicants to this fund. They hear about it from their advocates, they hear about it from their friends, they hear about it from their families, and getting that word out really makes it different in connecting these survivors to these resources. The majority of applicants who apply to the Survivor Fund have sought out resources before. That really aligns with the fact that the majority of applicants come from some nonprofit or community organization. When survivors do seek out resources, they seek them out for a variety of things. The top most sought resources in 2024 was mental health services and counseling, along with financial assistance, legal assistance, and shelter. The wonderful thing about the Survivor Fund is that it can help survivors with all of these things because of the key principle of flexible payments. When survivors are referred to the Survivor Fund, they can decide which types of needs they fulfill with their own funds. In terms of what makes a survivor eligible for the Survivor Fund, the most important factor is that they identify as a survivor of gender-based violence. We know that many survivors of gender-based violence experience multiple types of violence. The majority of survivors identified as survivors of domestic violence, but also 39% of survivors identified as survivors of sexual assault, 54% identified as survivors of stalking, and 10% identified as survivors of human trafficking. Very few survivors identified as a survivor of one aspect of gender-based violence, but not another. We see that only 3% of survivors said that they were a survivor of sexual assault, but not domestic violence. Only 2% that said that they were a survivor of stalking, but not domestic violence. And only 1% said that they were a survivor of human trafficking, but not domestic violence. This really highlights the complex array of violence that survivors are experiencing when they encounter the fund, when they are asking for help with resources. It can show the wide array of things that survivors may need assistance with and what they might use their funds for. In terms of eligibility criteria, when survivors are awarded funds from DFSS, there are three kinds of documentation that they might need to provide through the application process: identity, residency, and income documentation. If a survivor does not have access to these records for any reason, maybe that they don't have access to their home, maybe that their abuser has these records and are keeping them from them, survivors are able to self-attest to these things. About 32% of income documentation were self-attestations, 50% of residency documentation were self-attestations, and 3% of identity documentation were self-attestations. This makes up about 2% of all applications, has some type of self-attestation in them. This ability to self-attest really helps survivors be able to receive the funds even if they don't have the documentation. It really reduces barriers and allows a large array of survivors to access this important assistance. The majority of survivors who apply for the fund are English or Spanish speakers. 78% are English speakers, 22% are Spanish speakers. The application is provided with English and Spanish text in tandem so that applicants can read the application in their preferred language and to limit communication issues that might make the application harder to fill out. In terms of how applicants identify, they're able to choose multiple racial identities in their application. The majority of applicants say that they identify as Black or African American, 53%, or Hispanic, 41%. And then 60% of applicants say that they identify as some other race. In terms of genders, 90% of recipients identify as women, 10% identify as men, and 1% identify as trans, non-binary, or genderqueer. Not every recipient identified their sexuality. Only about 68% of recipients reported their sexuality. But of those who did report their sexuality, 91% identified as straight, 3% identified as gay or lesbian, and 4% identified as bisexual. We know that people of marginalized communities are less inclined to report their demographic data for fear of further marginalization, and this fear might skew the data so that these proportions might not accurately and fully represent the full span of recipients, depending on who chose and who did not choose to report. The age of recipients spanned from minor recipients to recipients older than 65, but recipients were most likely to be in their 30s or near their 30s, in their 20s or 40s. Only 69% of recipients identified their ability status, but of those who did, 19%, around 529 people, said that they had a disability. And we also know that the majority of survivors who received funds from the program are parents, around 68%. The majority of survivors who are parents have one dependent, that's 38%. 33% of parents had two dependents, and 18% had three dependents. Around 10% of survivors had more than four dependents. And we can really see how the funds are so important, not only for the well-being of the survivor, but the well-being of their families as well. In terms of income, the majority of recipients, around 65%, made an income under the federal poverty line for a single adult. But we also know that the majority of survivors who received funds are parents, meaning that they might be below the federal poverty line in a way that we haven't measured, but also in a drastic way. The majority of respondents have zero income, and this really highlights the fact that survivors are taking care of their families, trying to pay rent, trying to buy groceries with no income. And the flexibility of the Survivor Fund allows them to take care of multiple of these aspects in whatever way that they deem most important for their children, for their home, in whatever way they need. In terms of housing, the majority of survivors owned or rented their home, around 67%, but around 30% of survivors experienced some sort of housing instability, whether that was homelessness, living permanently with others, or moving frequency. They experienced some type of unstable, uncertain environment. If you had to picture the Survivor Fund as one person, it would be a parenting woman of color in their 30s who rented or owned their home and lived under the federal poverty line. This is the demographic that is most attracted to the Survivor Fund that we serve most often, that might greatly benefit from the ability to spend a wider range of flexible funds. When survivors apply to the Survivor Fund, we ask them to identify their needs, and the needs that are identified are essential day-to-day requirements. It's their food, it's their utilities, it's their rent. The top 5 needs in 2024 are the same as the top 5 needs in 2023, although some needs might have moved up and moved down in ranking. All type 5 needs, though, in 2024 increased in demand compared to 2023, meaning that more people said that they needed help with these things in 2024 than they did in 2023. The most dramatic increase in demand was rent, which increased 14%, from 72% of people saying they needed that help in 2023 to 86% of people saying they needed that help in 2024. The next part of this presentation is about the data that we received from our follow-up survey. This is the survey that we send to survivors 1 or 2 months after they received their funds, ideally after they have spent some of their funds. Participation in the survey is completely optional, and we ask survivors how they spent their funds, if they still need after they spent their funds, and how the funds affected them in key ways. For follow-up on Survivor Fund recipients, we collect qualitative data in 2 ways. We interviewed survivors for an in-depth account of their story and how the Survivor Fund affected their ability to manage things that were happening in their lives. We also received quotes from survivors who filled out the follow-up survey. The quotes are a shorter form comment on what survivors liked and maybe what they needed help with in the survey, about their experience after they received the Survivor Fund. We distributed around 3,000 surveys in 2024 and received 557 responses. That's a response rate about 18%. The proportions of who filled out the survey are very similar to the proportions of people who applied to the fund. 86% of people who filled out the surveys were survivors filling it out for themselves. Around 14% were advocates filling it out for a client. And then less than 1% were adults filling out the survey on behalf of a minor. In the survey, we asked feedback about the process of filling out the application, really identifying how we succeeded in terms of our 4 pillars of making the application easy, of having the funds be accessible. Program feedback for the Survivor Fund was overwhelmingly positive. 87% of survivors said that the application process was clear. 84% said the application was easy. 65% said that communication during the application was helpful. And 63% said that if they needed help, contact information was available for them to receive help. During the follow-up survey, we asked survivors to self-report on how they spent the Survivor Fund. Spending of the funds that they received mirrored very closely what survivors said they needed help with in the first place. Survivors are very good at determining what they need, what might help them, and survivors who said that they needed help with food spent on food. Survivors who said they needed help with rent spent on rent. And the top 5 self-reported spending matches very closely the top 5 needs reported at the time of applications. We also ask survivors what they still need help with after they have spent some of their funds. We really wanted to identify the scope of the funds and the scope of its help, how survivors are using the fund, and how the fund could go further in assisting survivors. Again, the top 5 needs when we surveyed survivors is very similar to the top 5 needs when survivors applied for the Survivor Fund at the application stage. The top 5 needs when we surveyed them were rent, food, utilities, transportation, and toiletries. Knowing what survivors need help with, what they spend on when they get that help, and what they still need help with afterwards helps us understand where money and time and resources should be given in order to help survivors with what they need with most. Survivors overwhelmingly said that the Survivor Fund really helped them in a time of need, and they expressed in their own words how important it was to have this aid at a time where they were really worried about what was going to happen to them, how they were going to get by. One survivor said about their rent and mortgage payments that the help that was given helped them to sleep in peace, knowing that the rent and their other bills were paid, and that they were so thankful that the help was given. Another said that the fund helped them pay for half of their mortgage. In a situation where survivors are paying rent and mortgage without income, with dependents, sometimes multiple, we can see how this influx of funds can really change their lives, can really alter a situation that is dangerous for them. In the follow-up survey, we also asked survivors to identify some outcome statements that were true for them on a variety of topics. For their safety, 34% of survivors said the funding helped them to leave an unsafe situation. 51% of survivors said that the funding helped them to stay safe. And 61% of survivors said either was true. Either the funding helped them leave an unsafe situation or it helped them to stay safe. Funding from the Survivor Fund can help survivors flee an abuser, find new housing, or become financially independent. Survivors who talked about safety in the survey, who spoke about how the Survivor Fund helped them with their safety, said that they got out and they had nothing, that the network was the only help they had as a single mother, and that it was something that they will spend the rest of their life being grateful for and finding ways to help others once they were back on their feet. Another survivor said that the fund helped them escape their abusive ex-boyfriend and his bigoted family, that they would have been killed without it. And not long after leaving, there were bullet holes in the glass windows in the area I would have been. You can see in these quotes how important the flexibility of funds is for survivors, that because they can spend the funds on whatever is most important to them, they can choose what they need to spend on in order to get to a safe situation, because it is different for every survivor. Also ask survivors about their emotional well-being, how the funds help them with their emotions when dealing with a difficult situation. 54% of survivors said the funding helped them to feel more hopeful about the future. 28% said since receiving this funding, the emotional effects of what happened to them improved. And 59% said either the funding helped them to feel more hopeful or the funding helped improve their emotions. When we asked survivors about how the fund improved their housing outcomes, we got a slightly smaller response. 40% of survivors said that the funding had improved their housing situation. We saw before that though the funding can really help survivors improve their situation, that survivors still need help afterwards. Because the survivor fund is a one-time payment, it might not be able to fundamentally change their a survivor's housing situation. We know it might help with 1 month of rent for a survivor, but the next 11 might be very difficult. Data from survivors reflect that they need more help, that they would like more from the fund, that they would like to see the fund expanded. As we saw before, the majority of survivors come to the Survivor Fund already connected to resources. The Survivor Fund aims to be able to connect applicants to resources and assist them after the funds have been distributed. And so, though many survivors come to the Survivor Fund already connected, around 8% of survivors said that they know more about resources, about housing utilities, about transportation, and other things after being connected to the Survivor Fund. And about 82% of survivors, after distributing the funds, said that they were already connected or that they are more connected now. Thinking about the needs of survivors after they received funds, 46% said the funding was helpful, but it was not enough to cover their needs. 8% said the funding was helpful, but not received fast enough to meet their needs. And 46% said either that it was helpful, but not enough, or helpful that it wasn't fast enough. When we look at these survey responses, there are three things that emerge about unmet needs of survivors. Survivors really wish that there were larger grant sizes. They say it's very helpful to receive $1,000, but I wish I had received $2,000. They also say that they would like repeat grants, that they would have liked to receive $1,000 3 times over a period of time. They also said how the application had so much popularity that it was hard to get an appointment and that they wanted more money for the fund in order for more people to get funds. We know that survivors are very, very good at determining what they need, at determining what they will help them. And in order to improve the lives of survivors, to get more survivors to safety, to make sure more survivors can care for themselves and their families, we really need to hear what they're saying that they need, which is more access to these funds, more funds, and repeated funds.
This next section of our presentation, as we kind of bring this discussion to a conclusion and before we open the floor to questions, is really aimed at synthesizing what we heard about what's working in the Survivor Fund and what remains an unmet need, and thinking about how we can bolster our existing social safety net and investments in the fund to help us continue to do this work and to do it even better in the future. First of all, we thought we'd take a moment to share a little bit about some exciting improvements to TANF that happened just this spring. TANF, for folks who don't know, is Temporary Assistance for Needy Families. It's a federal grant that's administered by the state of Illinois to eligible low-income families, and it provides them with some of that direct cash assistance that we provide them as well through the Survivor Fund. That's part of that larger public benefits social safety net, something that many folks who come to the Survivor Fund are also eligible for and in theory should be accessing. However, we know, and I don't think it will be a surprise to hear, that programs like TANF have often been very challenging for folks to navigate. And the network was very proud to lead advocacy in support of a bill that passed this spring that makes really substantial improvements to TANF specifically for survivors. So we'll talk a little bit about what that looks like. TANF has lots of requirements in order to be eligible to receive that benefit. And those requirements can be particularly burdensome to survivors of gender-based violence. Oftentimes that means they become disqualified during the course of having originally been approved for benefits and then losing them. Or that can look like somebody opting out altogether, even though they qualify, not believing that they could maintain those requirements and choosing not to use the system at all. Even though this would be an incredibly valuable tool for many survivors in sort of making ends meet. In recognition of the burdensome nature of these requirements on survivors, the federal government created a waiver and encouraged states to offer it to folks. It's called the Family Violence Option Waiver. And this waiver basically allows folks to be opted out of some of those burdensome requirements. Survivors who qualify for the exemption historically have not been likely to receive it. It's been sort of inconsistently and infrequently issued, although it would make the program more accessible to folks. And so this new law, we're very pleased to say, will require what's called a family safety notice to be on every application. Basically, it creates a wider net of information so that anybody who applies for TANF understands that there is a benefit to disclosing their survivorship and that it will potentially make their experience with TANF more accessible and accommodating to them. It also streamlines the application process. Whereas before, if you pursued the waiver, you might have to go through additional applications and additional interviews. Now, if you disclose, you have everything you need in one application process, and that waiver determination happens all at once. There's another piece to this bill, I think, something that we are even more excited about, and that is related to crisis assistance funding. Crisis assistance funding is a sort of separate pot of money that is available to folks who are already receiving TANF, who are experiencing a qualifying crisis. This includes domestic or sexual violence, along with some other things like experiencing homelessness, natural disasters, facing eviction, that kind of thing. Historically, again, as you might expect, this funding was issued quite inconsistently and infrequently, and folks who did receive it were often receiving relatively low average payments. This new law has really created a fundamental shift in how this funding will be able to shape people's lives when they are facing that crisis. Under the new law, folks will be who are eligible for crisis assistance funding will be able to receive 4 months of $1,250 payments each month. And as we have heard, this is very in line with recommendations from our own Survivor Fund recipients, who say that those one-time payments, while helpful stopgaps, don't always help them build the sort of safety net and nest egg for themselves. But this new change may be something that goes an incredible length to help folks really build stability in their own lives. And we hope that it is a valuable supplement to folks who are perhaps using TANF as well as other financial support systems like the Survivor Fund. Outside of things like improving our public benefits system, we also want to talk a little bit about our vision for the future of the fund itself. And we actually have a summary quote here from the end of the report that I think puts it really nicely for folks. Data from this report is concrete evidence of positive impact that the direct cash assistance of the Survivor Fund is having and will continue to have on Illinois survivors. It also clearly calls for further investment to address the needs that go beyond these one-time payments to support survivors and building stability over time. Investments from private donors, as well as state and local governments from other jurisdictions, are going to be essential to ensure that no survivor is left behind. The fact of the matter is the Survivor Fund has scaled incredibly successfully, and it has done that with a track record of incredibly positive impacts among our clients. And we think that growing the Survivor Fund, both in its size and in its offerings, is something that will continue to shape survivors' lives here in Illinois for the better. Now, we would be remiss to say goodbye to you all today without offering you a chance to support the Survivor Fund right now before you leave this meeting. And that is by supporting the city budget, our city budget campaign that launched earlier today. As we talked about at the beginning of today's presentation, those ARPA dollars, that COVID-19 federal pot of funding, is coming to an end this year. And that funding is one of the things that sort of spurred the expansion of the Survivor Fund. Its absence is something that will create a massive gap in gender-based violence services funding across the city, and specifically within the Survivor Fund. The network is leading the charge in asking for level funding for all gender-based violence services in the city of Chicago, and specifically for $4.8 million in funding to the Survivor Fund in FY26. All you have to do to join us in this call to support the Survivor Fund and gender-based violence services generally is scan the QR code on the screen. It'll take you to a form where you enter your name, your email, your address, and you can send an email to your alderperson and the mayor and let them know that this program is effective, it is essential, and it cannot go. We're proud to offer some creative solutions to the revenue gap that we were facing with the lack of ARPA dollars. And we really want folks to know that this is not an unsolvable problem. So you can help us kind of go to bat for this program and others like it by joining this campaign and scanning the QR code. It truly takes less than 2 minutes. It is so fast. I did it right before logging on today. Lastly, you might be interested in staying connected with us, and we hope you choose to do so. If you visit our website, you'll be able to download our report. You can sign up for our mailing list and be kind of first to know what is the latest with measuring safety when new reports come out. And you can access a one-pager that kind of briefs all of the information we covered today in very short terms. We do expect one more edition of Measuring Safety to come out still this year. That's our gender-based violence services report expected in October. And really, if you are interested in the work that we are doing, the best way to be in the know about that is to visit our website and sign up for that mailing list. So you can scan this QR code or just go to the-network.org. All the details you need are right there.
Well, thank you all so much for joining us. We really look forward to having you at a future Measuring Safety launch and hope that you will participate in our advocacy campaign to make sure that our Survivor Fund program continues to be funded and support survivors throughout the Chicagoland area.